All right, we'll try it again. 9:15 here on a Sunday morning, and I get to have Bible class, and I get to have people sitting in front of me. That is nice. Last several times I've stood right here, and not one soul in this room. And hopefully I got the message across, and hopefully you've been able to follow along, but it sure is nice to have you sitting here with me this morning. Last time we looked at verse 8 down to verse 17, and we were looking at the fact that those that are not following God are in the darkness, and those that are following God are children of the light. And then he is asking and pleading and begging with the Ephesians to make sure that you are living as children of the light. Well, we come to verse 18, and there is a contrast that's going to be made here. I do not know for a fact, but I suspect that in the church at Ephesus that there was a problem. Certainly earlier in this chapter, he addressed sexual immorality, so that would have been a problem. He addressed their language, and that's a problem, and that's a problem even among God's people, even down till today. So I suspect that there was a problem with the first half here also of this verse 18. And I'm only going to talk about the first half today. And then in the next lesson, we'll start with that second half and go on down to verse 20. But the first half, verse 18, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. I wanted to stop and talk about this subject. It's not one that's really talked about a whole lot in this day and time, but I think that it's important for us to address this and to think about what he is saying there, because it is, I think, still a problem in just about any congregation you would want to find around the city or the county here, that there is still a need to stop and to think about what God's Word has to say along this line. So when we look at this, there's really only two specific questions that I have with this half a verse. And the first one, he taught the Christians at Ephesians they were not to do what? Get drunk. So he is telling them very clearly that is something that as God's people you are not to do. And then he does say that if you do get drunk, it's going to lead to something else. What would it lead to? Yes, debauchery. And debauchery, what is that? That's one of those words I just not all familiar with. And about every time I come across that word and study that word, I got to go back and remind myself what that word means. What's the idea behind that? That's it. Excessive indulgence in sinful pleasures. Another word that is sometimes used there is dissipation. So you do things when you are drunk that you don't normally do. There are things that when you are sober, it is easy to say, no, I'm not going to get involved in that. But when you have the wine that is now affecting you, and really when we're talking about wine there, we're talking about any form of alcohol. When it is affecting you, then you are going to do some things that typically you would not have done without the wine in you. And most of the time it is doing something that you think is going to bring you some pleasure. There are some other synonyms of these words, and maybe these are some words that would help you to understand the idea behind it as well. Degeneracy, corruption, depravity, wickedness, and indecency. So all of those would be synonyms of this word as well. Well, when he says do not get drunk, the first question I'd ask myself is, well, what do we mean when we say do not get drunk? What does it mean to be drunk? being impaired both physically or mentally. In other words, you are not quite the same person. There is now something that has some type of control over you. So your body or your mind is not working as it normally does. There are some differences because of the influence of that alcohol. Did some research. I don't know if you know the answer to this off the top of your head or not, but how many people in America have an alcohol problem? By that I mean literally an alcoholic. What part of the population would you say that that would apply to?
The whole population has a problem with alcohol because it has so many dire consequences.
Sure.
Something I read that alcohol kills one person every 10 seconds. Every 10 seconds.
Every 10 seconds. One person dies some way due to alcohol every 10 seconds, the statistic he has. It does affect us all. Even if you don't drink a drop, you're affected by it. I've read in the past, and I've shared with you in the past, statistics from the medical field, work-related. You know, how many people call in sick, can't make it to work today? Well, they're not really sick, they're drunk. And that affects your business and everything about your business when that happens. 2.7% of Americans have a very severe problem. And you might say that doesn't sound like a whole lot. But this next one tells you there are 45.7 million Americans that are alcoholics. How many Americans are there? 360 million. 45 million are alcoholics. That they're going to be like the passage we look at in Proverbs in a little bit, that they wake up saying, when can I find me another drink? Now, that's a lot of folks. And so it is a major problem. I will tell you there are nations around the world that's worse than us. But it is a severe problem that we do have. And so we know that it can creep into the church as well. And here is a warning from Scriptures, from Paul himself, saying don't allow this to happen within your life. Within the last month, so let's just say the month of January, there are 65 million Americans that would have binge drink. Now what do we mean by that? They may be in their house, and they may go to the bar, or they may go to the party, and their sole purpose is what? Get drunk. I'm going to drink as many as I can till I am good and plastered. 65 million Americans per month will do that. I think most of you in here would be like me and say, I can't imagine finding any pleasure in that whatsoever. But yet there are a lot of folks who do that. As a school teacher, I listened to so many kids, and basically I had 14 and 15-year-olds in my classroom. Earlier years, I may have had several juniors and seniors, so 17 and 18-year-olds as well. And all they could think about was, where's the party Friday night? That's all they could think about. Friday night, Saturday night. I've sat there and I've listened to kids talk about going to these parties, getting drunk at these parties on Saturday night and walking in the door about 7 or 8 o'clock on Sunday morning. Mama says, all right, get your church clothes on, we're going. Didn't want to be there. And you think about how they had just lived the last 12 hours totally contrary to what they're about to think about for the next hour or two. We have a problem, a severe problem within our nation. Well, I asked this question. Here are some things that I want you to just consider also. How is drunkenness portrayed from biblical characters' lives? So first of all, Noah. When you think about Noah, you think about the ark. And I cannot help but think about how God holds him up as an example to the world. He found favor in the eyes of God. He was a righteous man, but after going through everything that he went through, the building of the ark, the mockery that he heard, and then actually living through that flood, very shortly after that, what happens? Well, he gets drunk. And when he is not able to be fully acting and thinking as he should, there's another thing that happens. It talks about his son Ham saw his nakedness, and then that's where the curse came upon his grandson. Lot. We think about Lot, and he's really pictured as being a righteous man who was vexed in his soul by what he saw going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. A lot of people are highly critical, but that's what the Scripture has to say. He was a righteous man, deeply troubled by all the wickedness that he saw around about him. But he left Sodom and Gomorrah, basically had to be dragged out of there. His wife did not survive the trip. His 2 daughters did. What did his 2 daughters do? Got him drunk. Got him drunk so that they could lay with him, so that they could have a child. They just didn't know how they was going to find another man, so they decided to use their dad. And you got 2 tribes that are going to come about to be constantly bothersome to the Israelite people. Now, how drunk was he? He's so drunk that he didn't know that his own daughter came in and shared his bed that night. He's out of it. Totally out of it. And yet that's how those 2 children came into this world. Story of Ben-Hadad, one that you might not be nearly as familiar about, in 1 Kings chapter 20, verses 16 to 34. He and 32 kings are getting drunk, just having a great old celebration when there's a battle breaks out and they were attacked. Belshazzar, Daniel chapter 5. What's he doing when he finds out he's about to lose his kingdom? He's having a drunken party with 1,000 men there celebrating. And then he sees the handwriting on the wall, and it's that very night his kingdom is taken away from him. And then I want to go to 1 Corinthians. I don't guess I got the first on there. But 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And here is a real severe problem that was taking place and that was being addressed by the Apostle Paul as well. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, beginning in verse 22. He says to Christians, and that's the only folks he's talking to here is Christians. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you for this? Certainly not. And he goes ahead to explain to you, or explain just exactly what is taking place as far as the Lord's Supper is concerned. Now, what brought all of that about? Well, in verse 21, for as you eat, and he's talking about the Lord's Supper, each of you goes ahead without waiting for anybody else. One remains hungry and the other does what? Gets drunk. Can you imagine that? That we come together and then afterwards we have a fellowship meal down there, and you got to help some of your fellow Christians out to the car because they are stumbling, they don't have control of themselves. That's just unimaginable to me. And yet that's what Paul is having to say to them at that time. And so Was there a problem at Ephesus over this? I can't say for a fact, but I think it's probably a problem with every congregation that there is, that there's likely to be one person, if not many people, that have a problem with this, and it's just not visual where other Christians can see it. Well, I want to take a look at how Scriptures portray drunkenness. And we're going to start off in the book of Proverbs, a single verse there, and then a longer passage that I want you to think about. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 1 is the first verse that we'll look at. It says, "Wine is a mocker, and beer a brawler, and whoever is led astray by them is not wise." That's the king of a nation saying that. Wine is a mocker. It'll cause you to mock your own life. It'll cause other people to mock you. And then, for some reason, it goes hand in hand that when you start to get tipsy and drunk, all of a sudden you think you're the strongest man around and you're willing to take on anybody. Fighting, brawling. And again, there's just a tremendous amount of injuries take place. And matter of fact, there's deaths that take place because alcohol got me thinking higher of myself than what I really am. Proverbs 23. I always have liked this passage, and this is Solomon describing the picture of an alcoholic. In verse 29, "Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaints?" That's true of a lot of lives, isn't it? But then listen to the next question. "Who has needless bruises? And who has bloodshot eyes?" Now we're going in a specific direction now. And he answers the question. "Those who linger over wine, who go to sample bowls of mixed wine, do not gaze at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and poisons like a viper. Your eyes will see strange sights, and your mind imagine confusing things. You will be like one sleeping on the high seas, lying on top of the rigging. They hit me, you will say, but I'm not hurt. They beat me, but I don't feel it. When will I wake up so that I can find another drink?" Typically, how do people react to a passage like that? You see a man like that on TV. What do they want you to do? They want you to laugh at that, aren't they? Oh, this is supposed to be funny. There's nothing funny about that picture. You know as well as I that when they are advertising beer on the TV, what's the picture look like? Yes, glamorous is what he said. Everything's wonderful. You've got the best looking women there. You've got the men that's got all their muscles showing everywhere. Everybody's having a great time. Everything's wonderful. Is that real life? It's not, is it? You can see by the questions that's starting to be asked right here. Who has sorrow, strife, complaints, needless bruises, bloodshot eyes? That's not what you want for yourself. But that's what alcohol is going to do for you. Thankfully, I've not been around much of that in my life. There's not been alcohol in my house. There was not alcohol in my parents' house. I guess you could say I was raised to be rather afraid of the stuff and stay as far away from it as I could. I had a neighbor growing up that on a real hot day, old July or August day, get outside working, he would open up a beer and drink one, and that was so bothersome to me. So bothersome. That's part of how I was raised, and there was a reason behind that. It was because of the idea of wanting to serve and glorify God. Alcohol just leads to trouble. It is something that is difficult for you to control. And it can come to the point that it controls you. I'm sure I've told you this story before, but the one thing that always stands out in my mind was when I worked at Snap-on Tools. I worked in the polishing department, and basically they were polishing wrenches and ratchets back there. And they worked on a piece system, so the more that you could do, the better off you were. But we had a man working there that he had some buddies there, and he used to own a restaurant, and he lost the restaurant, and so I think as a favor to someone, they gave him a job back there in the polishing department. And when you'd sit there on a stool, and here's a big wheel spinning in front of you, and you take your two knees and you put that wrench right here on your hand, and you go down that wrench, polish it on both sides. Well, this fella liked to carry a little flat bottle in his pocket, and he just had to go to the restroom mighty regular. Well, he'd done been down there several times already that night. We worked on the night shift. And he come up there, and he's polishing away, and the next thing you knew, he put that knee right in that belt. And just took that skin right off down to the bone. And then, oh, my knee! And he went like that and stuck the other knee right in there and did the same thing. Alcohol made that happen. That's the only thing that made that happen. There are all kinds of things happen when you get that evil influence within your life. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 11. Woe to those who rise early in the morning to run after their drinks. I can't imagine somebody climbing out of bed today thinking, where's my next drink coming from? But that's the picture of an alcoholic. Isaiah chapter 28, verses 7 and 8 talks about priests and prophets stagger from beer. Oh, so do the religious leaders get in on this sin too? That's another thing I won't ever forget. When I was working at Snap-on, I met a boy that was Vietnamese. It was a very interesting story. He was in high school, senior in high school, and they put a gun in his hand and said, "Go fight." He was out fighting in the field one day, and he was in a foxhole, and he said a helicopter landed, and everybody got out of their foxholes, and they ran, and they got on that helicopter. They landed somewhere else, and the next thing he knew, he landed in Alabama. He had no intentions of coming to the United States, but jumping on that helicopter, went to the next place, and the next thing he knew, he was there. Well, somehow or another, he made it up to southern Illinois there, and he was working there at Snap-on Tools, and he found a girl, and they decided to get married. I got invited to the wedding. Well, it was an Episcopal wedding, and there was a table there, like our big round ones down in the fellowship hall, and there was about 3 priests there today with their collars all on. One of them performed the wedding, the other 2 were there with them. They were the first ones in line, and they grabbed as many beer bottles as their hands would hold. And by the time I left there, those 3 men had that entire table nearly covered with empty beer bottles. Now that was a shocker to me. Somebody said that supposedly a man of God Now, everybody doesn't see things the same in the old religious world either, do they? They thought that was quite all right. But that was really troublesome to me. Isaiah's warning to the Jewish priests, do not be involved in that. Galatians chapter 5, we are looking at a list of sinful acts, and drunkenness is listed there. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3, Peter's talking about some things that pagans do, and one of those things is drunkenness. Another thing in that list is debauchery. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 6 through 9, is talking about what the Corinthians used to do before they became Christians, and one of the things listed in there was drunkenness. So when we become God's children, and like what was the passage that was looked at last week, living as children of light, you leave that behind. That's not to be a part of your life. Well, I also want you to understand this when we look at this passage. And it goes back to some of the background that I gave you at the very beginning of our study. In verse 18, it's going to say, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit. So he's really talking about what is going to be affecting your life. It's really about your worship. And whenever I stop and I think about what they typically understood as far as worship was concerned, again, in our introduction, we talked about the temple of Dionysus, the temple of Bacchus, and really that was a temple to wine. That so much of the worship that they had been familiar with as far as idolatry was concerned involved getting drunk. Not so in Christianity. And so he is reminding them, do not get drunk at all. Well, I think I'm going to stop at that point, and I've been going 45 minutes, so we're down to half an hour, so I don't know if I get too many lessons completed in 1 week now, but this will be a good stopping point. And here's something I want you to think about if you haven't already. Do Scriptures allow the drinking of wine? We're going to talk somewhat about that. I've got some of the original words along this subject as well to think about. And then I got some questions I want to think about along that line. And whenever we finish that, if it's 10, 15, 20 minutes, then we'll move on to that next one we're going to talk about, but be filled with the Spirit. Sure is good to see you. Glad that you're here. And thanks for being in class here this morning.